Hello, everyone. Happy Friday. Welcome to this week's ITS Davis seminar. I am really delighted to introduce this week's guest speaker, Norman Garrick, who's a professor in civil and environmental engineering at the University of Connecticut. But I think it's fair to say that he's a convert to planning, and maybe I certainly think of him as being as much a planner as an engineer these days, but he's been a really important voice for rethinking our approach to streets and places, and helping the engineers think about streets in a new way. I got to know Norman when he came to Davis for a sabbatical some years ago, and from the title of his talk, it looks like he's going to be reflecting on some of what that experience was about. I should note that that photo on the first slide is not Davis, for those of you who have not yet been here, but I'm sure he's going to tell us about that. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Garrick. Thank you, Norman.
Thank you very much. It's a real honor to be making this presentation. It almost feels like homecoming. So to explain this slide, this is my hometown. This is one of the commercial centers of Kingston, Jamaica. And I thought I would include it because a lot of my work reflects trying to understand transportation in the context of a place like Jamaica, in a poor country like Jamaica, and how transportation influences the economy, the environment, etc. in a place like that. This picture was taken actually in 2004. 2004 was a huge year for me in terms of travel. It was a year of sabbatical. I spent 2 months touring Europe. I think I went to 30 cities in 2 months. And then I spent 2 months in Davis. And then I spent the rest of the year in Kingston, Jamaica at the University of the West Indies. And it was a really seminal time for me in terms of me thinking about transportation. I should tell you a little bit of my background going up to that point. Prior to 1996, I was a pavement engineer. And I decided after I got tenure around 1994, that I no longer wanted to be a pavement engineer. And I didn't know what I was going to do when I grew up. But then I took a sabbatical at Cambridge University in the UK. And that place really opened my eye to both eyes to a different way of living. People biking, a very strong city center, place where you could see old people coming to shop, coming to play, coming to work. And so that experience in Cambridge really led me down the path of trying to understand how transportation related to placemaking, to sustainability, to the economic vitality, all of those subjects. And it took me a really long while to get up to speed, to understand some of the issues. And coming to Davis in 2004 helped that maturation, helped me to understand the issues, and also gave me a very strong research direction. So that's some of what I want to talk to you about today. I want to start the presentation. Okay. With this image here. And some of you might recognize this image. This was taken about 2 years ago. And I was living at the time in Zurich, Switzerland. And this image went around the internet, around the world. And it was to represent just how horrible auto dependency was in the United States. So I'll just leave it at that for the time being, because it really reflects the next image that I'm going to show. I almost always start or include this image in my presentation. And some of you that have studied these issues probably recognize what is going on here. Some of you might not, because there are no labels. But this basically is what happened since around 1908 with the increase of driving in America. And you can see it's been an exponential increase in driving. It's so big, in fact, that you could say it's almost almost extraterrestrial, the amount of driving we do each year in America. You have to measure it in terms of light years to put it in context. And one of the things that is interesting about this graph is that compared to other very car-dependent countries like Canada and like Germany and like Japan, we are much, much more auto-dependent. We're driving more than 2 times more than people in Japan and Germany. And if you recall, those are 2 car manufacturing countries. And why this is important is because of this slide, because of all the implications that come from having so much driving, the injuries, the climate implication, the health implication, the petroleum use, the fatalities, the obesity, the urban destruction. All of those are related to the amount of driving we do. All of those are related to how we have transformed the urban and rural environment to allow the amount of driving we do. So the reason why I'm going to show this slide again, you will see something very interesting in this video. So a lot of people focus on the cars, and I'd intended to show this because of the cars. And then I started looking at this more carefully. And around now, you might see something interesting going on here. And what that is, this is a picture of LA. And what that is a train in the midst of this sea of cars. And for me, it's fascinating because what it's telling me is a place like LA, a place that is known for its car culture, even there has cotton on to the idea that this is not a sustainable way of living, that they have to change and try to do something else. But you see how difficult or almost impossible the task is to retrofit this environment that they've created into a more transit-oriented environment. And what's interesting in our culture is the shift, is this change in attitudes that you're seeing reflected even on the national stage. And if you were listening to the debate last night, you could see now we finally have a party that is a national party that is willing to recognize that carbon and climate is an important issue for the first time. And that's the encouraging news. The discouraging news is that we have a transit user in our vice president, former vice president, who still cannot mention the word transit in talking about strategies to deal with this issue. So we still have a ways to go to the extent where it becomes politically viable for issues of transit, of proper planning to get to the fore. So we're still, as a country, at the stage where we're looking for eco solution, techno magic solutions like this. This is an electric vehicle. I'm not sure how that is going to help us with some of the other problems that we have. Or we are being sold on AVs, which is going to solve all our problems. Allow us to travel without the burden of having to drive. And even with this movie, finding love, falling in love with a car. I would warn you that this movie is very explicit. So if you look for it, be warned. So I am fascinated by places like Davis. And the reason is that Davis is an example of a place that is not solely beholden to techno solutions. Davis has developed in a very different way from a typical American place. And actually, I should extend that. It's developed in a way that is very different from a typical place almost anywhere in the world. People like to say Europe is different. And actually, Europe is not all that different. A lot of places in Europe are very conventional when it comes to transportation. There are exceptions like Zurich, like Amsterdam, like Oslo, like Copenhagen. But a lot of places follow along in the same pattern of American places. So in 2004, I had toured in Europe. I'd gone to Amsterdam, I'd gone to Vienna, I'd gone to Edinburgh. And I wanted to see what an American place that was different in its approach to transportation, what that looked like. And I was expecting to be disappointed. So I joined Susan's team, and I moved to Davis primarily for this one reason, that a large number of people rode to work in Davis. And I can tell you, without spoiling the story, that I was not disappointed by Davis. Davis is really a very special place. But what was interesting about being in Davis is that I went for the biking, and actually it ended up that something else was much, much more important to my experience there. That had to do with biking, but it had to do with something that I totally did not expect. What I found and what shocked me was that the road fatality rate was 1 in 100,000 in Davis. To put that in context, that is 1/10 of the rate in California at the time. That is 1/12 of the rate in the US as a whole. And I was fascinated. How could this be? As I told you, I was just learning about these issues. I didn't anticipate that a high biking city, which seemed to me that there would be a lot of targets to kill, that a high biking city would have such a low traffic fatality rate. So when I got back to Connecticut, I spent my evenings after work trying to understand what I found in Davis. And this is one of the graphs I put together. This is a graph of all 157 cities in California at the time, over 40,000. And what I found was that the traffic fatality rate varied significantly from 0 in, I believe at the time it was Danville, California, to 17.3. I think that was Bakersfield in the South. Davis was in second place, one of the safest places in the state. And this really further puzzled me as to what was going on. So I did some further analysis, and this is what I found, that if you you put the city in categories by when they were mostly built, pre-1950s versus post-1950s, this is what I found, that the traffic fatality rate for the older cities was somewhat less than those of the newer city. And you need to understand the context of this. Part of what we're seeing here is that these cities were built before we had an AASHTO design guide. And these cities were built after, and we had AASHTO design guide. So to break down the numbers further, the risk of fatalities for pedestrian in the pre-1950 cities, for bikers and for people in vehicles, compared to the post-1956 cities, 42% higher for pedestrians, 40% higher for bike riders, and 40% higher for people in vehicles. And again, what we're talking about here is pre-AASHTO versus post-AASHTO. Now think about what that means. The people building cities based on the official street design guide. In those cities, people are dying at a higher rate than cities that were built prior to that, before we had traffic standards encoded for these cities. This is really problematic for me. So I wanted to study what this really meant. And it seemed to me that it might have been related to speed. As you might know, the chance of being killed in a traffic fatality varies depending on the impact speed. 20 miles per hour, a 5% chance of being killed. 30 miles per hour, it goes up significantly to 45% chance of being killed. And at 40 miles per hour, almost your chance is very bad if you're in a collision with a car as a pedestrian at 40 miles per hour. So it seemed as if this might be at the heart of some of what I was finding in these older versus newer cities. And obviously then this would be related either to the design of the street themselves, this is in Los Angeles, or was it related to the design of street networks? Now, street networks are an interesting thing. This is something that is not taught in engineering school, but we have a very long history of exquisite street design in the US, starting with cities like Charleston, New Haven, Philadelphia, Savannah, and a lot to be learned from these places. But somehow, over the years, this skill has just totally evaporated, and we don't teach anything about this in our schools. Probably more in planning school, I don't know. Washington, D.C. So the question that versus anywhere in America, you can see the difference. This is city designed in 1790 versus almost any place in the country that was designed since 1950. So this actually is the suburbs of Atlanta, but could be almost anywhere in the US, any suburb in the US. So what happened? So when we were digging into this, what we found was a 1938 document from the Federal Housing Authority. And this is what it said. It was very explicit in what was bad and what was good design. Bad and good design. And it was also very explicit in why they promoted a design that went away from the traditional way that we had been designing places. It was about the economy, it was about the value of housing, etc. These were a booklet that was put out in 1938. The Depression happened, the war happened. This was not really implemented until after the war, starting 1946 with the Housing Act, and then everything just went crazy. And this is what I found interesting. This is what they said as to the reason why we should go away from the type of planning we see on the left to the type of planning we see on the right. They said the grid layout was monotonous, had little character, uneconomical, and unsafe for users. So us being engineers, I mean, I would question this monotonous and little character. If you think about the context of Washington, D.C., I think this is on its face patently ridiculous. But as engineers, we decided to start out with something that was easy to measure because we could not find any research that supported these contentions. So we started out looking at this question of whether one type of traffic street network was unsafe for road users. Just to give you a little bit more context about AASHTO, AASHTO is based on this idea of arterials, collectors, and local roads. And the idea of that goes away entirely from the pattern that you see in Washington, D.C. And in fact, is the blueprint for this pattern that you see in suburban suburban Atlanta, with the high mobility, low access roadways there, medium, high mobility, low access roadways, and local low mobility, high access, based on this famous chart from AASHTO, which is their famous S-curve of mobility versus access. There is actually, when you look at cities, cities do not behave like this in any way or form, but this is the way that we have decided that is the way we are going to design streets going forward from the 1950s. Okay, so the study we conducted was based on these 24 cities, and I'll spend a little time on this map because with a California audience, you probably recognize these places and the significance of these places. In general, there are two groups of cities. We selected cities that were some of the safest in the state, including Berkeley, including Davis, including Chico, including Santa Cruz. Those are all the green cities. And we also selected cities that were some of the least safe cities in the state, including West Sacramento, which is just up the road from you, and places like Rialto in the California, this Los Angeles area. So what we found was very interesting. Patterns such as the one on the left, which would say is what we see in San Francisco or in Davis, or to some extent in Los Angeles, versus the patterns on the right, which are all of those newer places. What we found was the chance of being injured was about 30% higher. The chance of being killed was 50% higher in these newer patterns. And I should say, this was not city versus city. This was actually, we looked at census blocks and divided them based on their street network patterns. So we had in the study over 1,000 different census blocks, and this is the finding. We also found, not surprisingly, that depending on the street pattern, the amount of walking, biking, and transit taking that you found was quite different. Again, not surprisingly. Maybe what is surprising is that we had 2% of people walking in these cul-de-sac patterns. So later we extended the study to look at health outcomes. This is the report from the Washington Post about that later study. It says, sprawl may be bad for your health. And it goes on to describe the study, 24 cities in California with a variety of different street patterns. We used the California Health Interview Survey for 4 years. We controlled for socioeconomic status, commuting times, the presence of fast food, grocery, and other land use. And we found that places with higher intersection densities were significantly linked to higher rates of, significantly linked to lower rates of obesity, diabetics, high blood pressure, and heart disease. 4 really serious health outcomes. This got a lot of play in the press. Of course, you can imagine the only thing that was of interest to the press. They weren't interested in diabetics or high blood pressure. All they were interested in writing about was obesity. Culture fat was one of the headlines that that we had. Do we look fat in these suburbs? And this one was the most puzzling of all. Just living close to Walmart makes you fat. So I think the bottom line is we can see just how significant placemaking is, not only in terms of our travel, but also the health of our citizens. So that was a really interesting 2 months in Davis. And one of the things I remember, or I had the chance to do, was to visit so many California cities. So this was actually, I didn't know it at the time, this was actually developing the knowledge and background, the way of looking at cities that really led and fed into that, that study of street networks. So I went to Calistoga, but I also went to a number of cities that Suzanne was studying at the time for a study looking at whether or not people self-selected places where they could bike, or the place influenced whether people would bike, walk, or use other forms of transit. So I went to cities like Modesto and a few others, but all scattered around the area, the valley, and also in Northern California. This was, I think, was a very important experience being in Davis. And I also remember one Sunday, Susan organized a trip to see new urbanist development all over the middle part of California, starting with the south, I don't remember the name of the place, but south of Sacramento, all the way down to Santana Row in San Jose. And I never forget that. It's a very strong memory, very important memory, and very formative in terms of my future experience as a board member of CNU. So looking at places is really, I've found to be really important and really interesting to try to understand land use, to be able to carefully look at places. So this map is from a study that I did a few years ago, of Hartford, Connecticut in 1950 and Hartford, Connecticut in 2009. And this way of looking at cities, not only what is there now, but also to understand how places changes, I think is really important for us as planners, as engineers, to really be prolific in our jobs. Hartford, Connecticut went from 16,000 parking spaces to 47,000 parking spaces over the course of 50 years. In a period when it was losing 50% of its population, it was losing jobs, and it had lost almost all retail in the city. And this is the fate of so many cities all over the country. And it's a fascinating story. Loss of tax revenue is also part of this story, with all this land being devoted to non-productive use. But one of the questions that we keep getting asked when we presented this result was, is it cause and effect? Did the parking cause additional driving? Or was it the fact that we had more driving, so we needed more parking? And so we decided to try to answer that question. And the methodology that we use is kind of appropriate, is a methodology that was used in the 1960s to answer the question of causation between smoking and lung cancer. In the 1960s, smoking, there was this causal relationship between smoking and lung cancer, but the tobacco industry kept insisting that there was no proof that one was causing the other, that smoking was causing lung cancer. This doctor, Sir Austin Bradford Hill, came up with a set of criteria called the Bradford Hill criteria as a way to demonstrate a causal association. And that's what we applied. And this method was based on these 6 or 7 criteria. And we decided to apply it to the data we had about parking, but also the literature of information. And what we found was that 8 points. What we found was that we could indeed say that parking induces more driving. I think this is a really important point, because often we're told that the cycle is we need to respond to people driving more. What we are saying here is that those cities that tore down themselves to provide more parking actually induced parking. So places like Berkeley, like Cambridge, that went in the opposite direction saw an opposite outcome. And this is really, 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 really important as we go forward in trying to change the paradigm for how we do planning. The end result of this idea that we need to provide more and more parking is this visualization that we did a few years ago of a city in Connecticut that is now really quite different. But this is a city that was in the turn of the century, one of the most prosperous in the country. Bridgeport, mixed land use, lots of residential near the downtown. The blue is the core of the downtown. This city today looks like this. An absolutely destroyed place for travel, for parking. Most of the white area is parking lot. So the end result of this idea that we need to respond to people driving more is that we end up with places that are, as Lewis Mumford referred to them as tombs. We have paved over the city and created a dead place. I'm also fascinated with places that have actually gone in the opposite direction. This is Amsterdam in the 1960s. This is that same street in Amsterdam. And I have been studying what is the implication of these changes that we see in a place like Amsterdam. What does it mean for quality of life? What does it mean for sustainability? And one of the things we are focused on is what it means in terms of people being killed on the roads. This is not Amsterdam, but this is for the country of the Netherlands. We have looked at traffic fatality rates per 100,000. If you remember, I pointed out that Davis is somewhere down here at 1 per 100,000. In the 1970s, Amsterdam, the Netherlands peaked at 25 fatalities per 100,000. The US peaked at just a little bit higher than that. What is interesting to me is what happened since. And part of what happened since is this. The US has seen up and down fluctuation and some long-term decrease in traffic fatality. The Netherlands, on the other hand, has dropped precipitously in the amount of people that are being killed on the roads. About 3 traffic fatality per 100,000 compared to the US rate of about 11 today. If you break it down by people in cars versus people on foot versus people on bikes, you can see just how much more dangerous it was in 1970 in the US. What's interesting is that in 1970, the Netherlands did not look that much different. It was much less safe to be a pedestrian than being a person in a car from a traffic fatality point of view. This is a measure of traffic fatality per users. So it's corrected for the number of people using the different modes. By 2015, this is what the US looked like. So we went from that picture to that picture in the US. We are doing much better for people in cars, worse for people on foot, and slightly better for people on bikes. But you can see the disparity between people in cars versus people on foot versus people on bikes. The Netherlands, on the other hand, now looks like this. And again, this is what the Netherlands looked like in 1970 versus what it looks like today. So this, we recently wrote a TRB paper about this. And some of the comments that came back is that you cannot compare the US to the Netherlands. This is not what this is about. This is looking at the Netherlands in 1970 and what they've done over the last 30, 45 years to change the paradigm. What they've done to change the paradigm is they changed how they thought, they're thinking about road users. In the US, we refer to people on foot like this lady as vulnerable road users. That's how they used to think about people on foot in the Netherlands. They no longer do that. Instead, and of course, if we think about people being vulnerable, then the way that we're going to deal with this is making them invulnerable. So supposedly, this is how we need to take to the road in the US if we are going to be able to maintain our lives on the road as pedestrians. So again, this is what the Netherlands looked like in 1970. This is where they are now. How did they get there? Well, they no longer think of people as vulnerable road users. They no longer, in fact, think about just the road users. They think about more the places that we're designing. And it's a huge shift in attitude, is a huge shift that we would like to see when people talk about Vision Zero, that they would understand that that also comes with thinking about changing our mindset. But in the US, we're still focusing on the user. How did this occur in the Netherlands? It occurred from activists taking to the street, protesting, stop killing the child murder, having die-ins by the Reich Museum, etc. But this led to institutional changes. This led to streets no longer looking like this and now looking like this. Streets for people on foot, streets for people on bikes. And in fact, the last time I was in the Netherlands 2 years ago, they're going even further now. This was a car street just 4 years ago. Now it's a street just for bikes and for trams. So a totally different attitude about how mobility should look like in our urban areas. Okay, so what we're seeing is really in a place like the Netherlands is a culture shift. The question is, can we also see that culture shift in America? The last few months, as you all know, has been so interesting, has been so strange, but some amazing things have happened. One of the things that have happened is the idea of Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter taking hold and leading to lots of great conversations. And I've been part of some of these conversations about how this issue of Black Lives Matter relates to transportation, relates to planning, etc. And I found this discussion to be somewhat frustrating. And the reason is that this is a quote from a great book that I would recommend to you all, In the City of Bikes, about the story of how Amsterdam became, again, a biking city. And one of the things he talks about is that in the 1960s in Amsterdam, both left and right supported increasing car ownership. The right did so because they felt that the explosion of cars represented the triumph of capitalism. The left, because they felt that poor people deserve cars as much as the bosses. In the last few months, in these discussions about Black Lives Matter and transportation and urban planning, some of the arguments that I'm hearing sounds a lot like this last bit here, that Black people should have the same access to things as everybody else. And I don't have a quarrel with that. What I have a quarrel with is that there is not any recognition of the role of this this disastrous way that we have developed transportation and urban planning in the country, and how that will continue to affect Black people, all kinds of people, as long as it is the way that we continue to do things. The 1690 project is reminding us that Black life has not mattered in America for over 400 years, that we need to systemically change. We need to address systemic racism. And in a lot of ways, the issues that we're facing with is also systemic, is also about how we can get rid of what is seen as normal, as this being the normal for how we create our cities. But beyond that, I think what is really important to me is that we need to recognize that America is truly exceptional. And it's exceptional in a way that distorts the discussion about things like urbanism, placemaking, and transportation. We need to understand that the reason, and this to me is the biggest point about this Black Lives Matters discussion, is that part of the reason why we are so exceptional is that racism feeds into how we have created, how we have sold suburbia. We all understand that, yes, the racism is part of the discussion, was part of the civil rights discussion from the very beginning in the 1950s with Rosa Parks. That's beginning to be understood more widely. We also understand the issues of government policies like redlining and the Housing Act and freeway placement in cities and all of that. But I think what is less understood is just how we have created place and the transportation system we have created, how much that is supported by the system of racism that is extant in America. And I think it's just beginning to really be revealed for what it is with the current regime that we have in place, with slogans like this. So this is important to me, circling back to my hometown. This is Kingston, Jamaica, in around 1920. And this is the main street in Kingston. And what strikes me about this picture is the dignity of the spaces and the places that were created by people that were just out of slavery. And I go back to Jamaica and I see this is the type of place that we have created now. This is the type of place that is created around cars, around car culture, around normalizing a very abnormal system. When you think about this picture, think not just about those girls, think about those people in those cars that are paying 60% of their salaries to be able to afford a car. Think about maybe 30% of all our national import going to import cars and petroleum. All of those things, when we think about equity and change in transportation, we really need to understand the systemic problems of auto dependency. And I think Davis really plays, places like Davis that are beyond the norm, that are not American-like, are very important. But I think there's also an interesting story about places like Davis. Places like Davis, places like Portland, places like San Francisco. The question that really needs to be fixed with these places is how can we make these places accessible to more people and not just people with the income to support it. So that's all I had, and thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Norman. That was wonderful and wonderfully inspirational. Towards the end there, you used the word dignity, and I want to think a lot about that, because that's certainly not been, part of how transportation engineers think about their work. But
yeah,
really
but when you look at that picture, I mean, what do you think of?
Yeah. Yeah.
To me, they're like they're in prison.
Yeah. Right. So how do we treat everyone with dignity? It's that, sort of that simple. All right. So there are a couple questions from students. Everybody out there, the students, you can chat me some questions and I'll call on you. And then other participants, you can use the Q&A to ask your questions. Ray, you asked a question a while back. Do you want to ask Norman?
Sure. I have added like so many more questions. It was really great to hear about what you just talked about. I hoped it didn't come to an end, but we don't have all the time in the world. I have to choose one question, so I choose this one. What do you think the role of individualism is in the current state of car dependency in US?
Okay, so I think one of the things I was thinking about when I was putting this presentation together is that we sell racism. A lot of the dysfunctional functions that we deal in this country is based on a series of myths. A myth of freedom, myth of rugged individuality, etc. I mean, and I think it's part of the mythology of selling these things. The opposite of that is the word that was the dirty word that was being bandied around last night of socialism, which in a lot of places that we admire is about how do we take care of ourselves? How do we take care of the planet? And I think we need to have a different mythology about individualism, that it's also about, it's not just about individual freedom, but it's also about individual responsibility. And that's what doesn't get said in the political discourse here.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Sequoia, you had a comment to me about how all this relates to enforcement. Do you want to ask about that?
Sure. Oh, I've got my cat background.
Love it. Love it.
Well, first I want to say thank you, Dr. Garrick. you're my hero right now. And I'm feeling very emotional with the way that you conveyed this information. And I'm very grateful for you being part of our seminar today. So thank you. And I myself study transportation equity and mobility justice, and I'm attending, you know, all these conferences, and there's always talks and presentations about equity, about justice, and of course a lot of critique of Vision Zero. And so I really appreciated the way that you were able to frame things, where it just sort of made like the enforcement piece obsolete through the humanization of users. And I think that's really important, because right now, as we're advocating for like defunding of police and all these sort of like radical imagined ways that we could do things, it's really about coming back to humanity and love. And I felt that through what you were sharing with us. And I'm really left with also some curiosity around your example around Holland, the Netherlands, and thinking about like the Netherlands is, and I appreciate like the transportation scholars focus on Netherlands as a place like to look to, and some of our biggest goals are being realized there. But of course, like racism is extremely rampant in Holland. I myself am from a Dutch colony and from Aruba, so hey, Caribbean. But you know, and I'm really curious if you experience or witness sort of like how racism came out there, and like is there also the disinvestment in certain communities that we really face here on such a big front, like you were sharing?
I think racism plays out very differently in a place like the Netherlands, and it's also not at the core of how people there see themselves, and that's the difference in the US, I think. I am not familiar. I spent 2 summers teaching a study abroad in the Netherlands. So that's my exposure to the Netherlands. I'm not knowledgeable enough about disinvestment, but I can talk about another city that I use as an exemplar is a city that I now live in part-time, which is Zurich, Switzerland. And it is very interesting to see the patterns there. Zurich, the city itself, it has poor neighborhoods and it has richer neighborhoods, but nothing like you would see in places like, say, Paris. These disparities and the treatment of different places are not to that kind of level. What's also interesting about Zurich is that the city of Zurich itself is like the promised land. The suburbs is where people with lesser income and more immigrants live. But again, it's not to the extent that you would see in a place like Paris, where you have very disenfranchised suburban areas. That might eventually happen in the Swiss context, but it's not there yet, and I don't think that's where they're headed.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, and it's you know, it's interesting what's going on in the U.S. too, that our suburbs are changing, right? That we do see more immigrants in suburban areas and lower income households in suburban areas. So, you know, what saving the suburbs means.
Exactly, and probably that's why it's not resonating with people.
Yeah.
It seems to have landed like a dud in a lot of places.
Yeah. Speaking of the suburbs, Trisha has a question about what do we do about all of this sprawl. Trisha, do you want to ask?
Yeah, so I grew up in the suburbs in Florida, and I do despair at how road-centric, car-centric everything is. But like how do we move away from that, given that these cities are already built and everything is already very car-centric?
Well, actually, that's kind of interesting because I teach a class called Case Studies in Transportation Planning this semester. And that was one of the first questions I got this year from one of my students. And I was a little bit stumped to begin with. But I think you're seeing It depends on what there are suburbs that are more urban-like. So of course, those are easier to deal with. There are also suburbs that have been transformed from more urban-like to with shopping malls, etc. We're seeing some action being done around things like retrofitting malls because all these malls are dying. So there are potential to do point intervention at places like malls. Also, if we have transit being extended into the suburbs, in Connecticut, we're starting to see so-called TODs. Some of them are pretty horrible, but there is the sense that we need to change them. So you're seeing changes like that. But I think Andres Duane, the CNU founder, always points out that it's not just about these places that need to be retrofitted. It's also about the places that we are going to be continuing to build, because we're going to continue to build places. So a big portion of what you guys need to be doing is looking at how do you build places that don't have some of the problems of these places that you grew up in. So it's not going to be easy. It's not an easy answer, but the way that the financing and the retail industry is going, the fact that some of these mansions in suburbia are failing, all of those are opportunities to change the paradigm.
Yeah, I think it's really the billion-dollar question, right? How do we fix it all? And all of us planners struggle with this a bit. You know, Davis did some very little things that make a big difference from the standpoint of the network, like you know, a bike bridge over Covell, or the little cut through that goes from Central Davis to East Davis and makes it possible for kids to bike to school. So, you know, sometimes they're little fixes that can have some difference if we do enough of it. A couple of students are asking about AASHTO and NACTO guidelines. So Sravya, do you want to start? And then Jeffrey after that.
Yeah, hi. I just wanted to ask, what has been the impact on mobility and accessibility when the cities were designed based on AASHTO guidelines?
It's been that actually I just got out of a meeting where Ian Lockwood, who is one of the great civil engineers, transportation engineers in the country, and he showed a picture of Broadway in Richmond when it was a city street with thousands of people on the streets, a streetcar in the middle. And that street has been recreated as a place for movement of people. And you see that it's a city that is absolutely dead. There's nobody there. There's a parking lot, there are blank walls. So the changes that we made, suburbia is one thing, but the changes that we made to suburbanize the cities has been disastrous. In a place like Hartford, people would walk to work, people would bike to work, people would take transit. We had transit going 40 miles in all different directions. Almost everybody now drive to work. So of course we need more bigger roads, or so they claim. We need more parking lot. So those are some of the implications of those changes. One of the interesting things about a city like Hartford is that we, in the 20s, 30s, used to have on-street parking. They actually got rid of on-street parking to make the street so people could just disappear into the suburb as quickly as possible. What it also means is cities like Hartford, Buffalo, instead of having people live in the core city, so Buffalo had 600,000 people in 1950. It now has 250,000. The metropolitan area had 1 million people in 1950. You want to guess how many people it have now? Guess?
Half of that.
It's 500,000 people now, but they're living on 3 times the land area. So these changes basically decanted people from the cities into the suburbs. but it wasn't that we were economically developing, is that we were just spreading. And that's the disaster that places like Buffalo, Rochester, most cities in the Midwest, in the South, that is what they're faced with. And part of that is the way that we conceived of mobility.
Jeffrey wants to ask you about an idea about NACTO and AASHTO. Could they be helpful in fixing our streets? Jeffrey?
Oh, should I just go ahead, or is he coming on?
Give him another second. Jeffrey, do you want to
Okay.
unmute? Or I could read your question. Oh, he can't. Okay, so NACTO and AASHTO could together implement outlines for roadway dieting, repairing the roadways in dangerous places to being facilities friendlier to walking and biking. Do you believe that roads in the US can be rescued like the roadways to tramway bikeway was rescued in Amsterdam?
Definitely, we're seeing it all over the country, in specific places though. If you go to Portland and Seattle and San Francisco to some extent, you're seeing that happen. I don't know what Sacramento is doing right now. I haven't been there so long. But I should point out that NACTO and AASHTO are two very different things. AASHTO is the evil empire, if you want to put it that way.
Do you want to explain a little bit?
I explained about the accident, for example. So NACTO came out of the tradition of rural road building. So it really wasn't their fault. Is that we applied the tools that they provided for the wrong thing. NACTO was developed to correct the problems. And NACTO has really great guides. So I would say if you're doing design, you should draw on the NACTO guides. They're really amazing. And their attitude and their understanding of street design is really good, and it's going to help us. It's helping us already in a lot of places to change how we do street design. When I lived in Davis, we did not have NACTO. Most places were based on using things like the AASHTO guide. While I was living in Davis, we developed something called the ITE-CNU document, which was one of the first urban street design document with CNU. That was one of the projects I had while I was in Davis. That was the forerunner of street design guide in cities like Chicago, Boston, and New York City. Those cities then formed together to become NACTO, the large cities, and NACTO has really taken this up a notch. So NACTO is really doing great work, and I would encourage you to look at their documents if you're interested in street design.
Can you say a couple of words about who NACTO is? Because not all the students.
NACTO is the National Association of City Transportation Officials, compared to AASHTO, which is the American Association of State and Highway Officials. Yeah, so it's the urban versus the kind of more rural attitude that is at war there.
Yeah. Yeah, so a lot of the innovation coming from the city level, really.
Exactly, yes.
Yeah.
And cities like New York City, Cambridge, Boston, places like that.
Yeah.
But for really great street design, I think you go to Seattle. Yeah, they haven't got to the stage where the Netherlands is, but they're pretty advanced.
Yeah, and they're doing interesting things with the green infrastructure, stormwater management.
Yes, Portland also, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, in fact, Portland developed extended their bike network by taking monies that would have been used to put stormwater underground. They decided that wasn't the way. It saved them a lot of money, and that was what they used to build out their bike network.
Yeah, great example of how, if we don't just keep these things all separate, but we actually think about our problems together, we can find some great synergies.
Yes.
Larissa wants to ask about gentrification, which is probably the $10 billion question.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes. So essentially, like, I understand like the United States needs to change their cities in some ways so that we can be more sustainable with transportation. And the biggest problem, I guess, when it comes to transportation planning is building these projects and potentially gentrifying the areas and harming like low class individuals or societies. And so I was wondering, like, what are some things that transportation planners can think about to potentially minimize those gentrifications?
Yeah. So I grapple with this issue, and I don't think the solution can be just coming, it cannot come just from transportation engineers, because we are embedded in in an economic system where it's not about, it's about capturing value. It's about, as soon as people see something that is valued, then poorer people get pushed out. It has to be about changing it has to be about things like making sure you have affordable housing, making sure that developing an area doesn't lead to displacement. But it's not a solution that can come from transportation engineers. In Zurich, again, which I'm familiar with, the city owns 60% of housing in that city.
Mm.
So you can imagine that if the city is involved in housing people, there's no stigma involved with city-owned housing. Actually, no, sorry, that figure is wrong. The city owns about 30% of housing. About 30% is also owned by these cooperatives that is used to ensure that people have affordable housing. We need to see changes like that. I don't know how else we can do it except fundamental changes in these relationships, these economic relationships.
We're back to the S word.
What is the S word?
Socialism.
Well, I don't know. I mean, the interesting thing about that S word and a place like Zurich is that I've never lived in a place that is more capitalistic. Mm-hmm. But it's a capitalism that understands that you need to have control, you need to have responsibility. Mm-hmm. And so it's not socialism in the least. In fact, I would say we are more socialist here in terms of government intervention.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So that's it for student questions. Students, if you have more questions, be sure to raise your hand or write something in chat. I'm going to jump to a couple of the outside questions. So Michael asked a question quite a while ago about going back to your work, comparing different kinds of cities and the two network designs. And actually, I have a question about this too. But Michael's question has to do with terrain.
Yes.
So a lot of the cities you looked at were relatively flat, where it's easy to have a grid. But what do you do when you've got some topography?
Is San Francisco? I'm not suggesting that we should build San Francisco, but San Francisco is an example of laying the grid on the hills.
Yeah, but does intersection density, I mean, does it sort of apply in the same way when you've got?
It doesn't apply in the same way. And one of the difficulty about talking about this is that when we talk about connectivity, people almost automatically go to the grid. And that's not what is being advocated here, is that you need connectivity. And the connectivity should respond to the terrain. It should respond to the land use. So it's really, you could do San Francisco and build through the hill or over the hill, or you could respond to the fact that there are flat places that you shouldn't build, places that you build. I would go back to Zurich. There, all the development is in the valley. And the city, the hills serves as an urban growth boundary, more or less. But now I think a lot of the skilled designers, such as with the CNU the DPZ folks, you look at projects that they've done in places like North Carolina and South Carolina, and it does take into account the terrain.
Yeah. And for those of you who don't know it, CNU is Congress for the New Urbanism.
Yeah, but DPZ is Duane Plater-Zyberg is the firm of Andres Duane.
Well, I'm happy to hear you emphasize connectivity, because I wanted to bring up Davis.
Yes.
Which on the surface looks like a typical suburb without a whole lot of a grid, but with a whole lot of cul-de-sacs. But what we've got is bike ped connectivity.
Yes.
Yeah. So do you want to comment on that? Or?
No, I think Davis has done a lot of great things, but I think actually the core of Davis is very much like the patterns that we're talking about. I know in the southeast are those neighborhoods with the cul-de-sacs that are connected at the ends.
Yes.
Yeah, in our study, that is something I would love to understand more, is how those places behave. We never actually looked at places like that have good pedestrian bike. Those are called permeable places for pedestrians, but not for cars.
Yes.
There are lots of ways of doing that, and it works well, even in places that have connected streets. And some places actually are overconnected, like Berkeley. And Berkeley had neighborhoods that were overrun by traffic. And what they've done is to cut off the connectivity for cars and have permeability for bike and ped. So it's, I think street design is really kind of, it's not, we talk about it in such kind of blunt language, but there are lots of subtlety to how these things work.
Yeah, I agree. And there aren't that many places like Davis that you could study where you have such great
interesting places that I love was village homes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and with the permeability for walking and biking all over the place, but not for cars.
Yeah, and talking about the Netherlands, did you ever make it to, I'm not going to say this correctly, but Houten?
Houten, oh, I hate that place.
Oh yeah, I always describe it as Davis on steroids.
I think the idea of the fact that cars can't drive through, but bikes and peds, that's great. The street network works from that perspective. It's the 1970s architecture that I hate about it.
Yeah, the town center does not have a whole lot of charm to it.
No, it's pretty horrible. It's a lot. Yes, 1970s Dutch architecture is pretty horrible.
Yeah, but the network is very interesting. So anybody who's interested, look at Google Maps for Houten, Houten in the Netherlands. Really interesting. Okay, and then Les has a question about the whole COVID pandemic issue and how that might affect this. And I think Ray was asking about that earlier as well. Is this going to make infill development and the kinds of places we're trying to create more difficult? Is it more of an uphill battle if people feel like they need more distance from each other?
You know, that's an interesting question. Of course, we're in the middle of the pandemic now. What I try to get some sense of what might happen is looking at Asian cities that have gone through some version of this. And what the research seems to show is that these places do not necessarily have, that denser places do not necessarily have more cases. And in fact, even New York City showed that the places with the worst cases in New York City was not where the density was. It was more where the poverty was. But the question also relates to, are people going to be wanting to use transit? What I can find out, what I can see from the literature is that it took people a few months to get back to riding transit in places like Hong Kong after previous pandemic. So being in the middle of the pandemic, it's hard to say what's going to happen, because it's going to depend on how we are able to contain and deal with the issues related to the illness.
Yeah, it's going to be a very interesting couple of years for sure. I think we'll do one more question from Daniel. Do you want to unmute, Daniel? About Greenbelt policies.
Yeah, so a while ago you were mentioning the difficulties, how we might not want to do what we've done in San Francisco, which is, identifying places that are optimal for urban and suburban development and places that are not optimal. And, restraint is an important part of that, identifying where we need to stop. So in your experience, what are the most common obstacles to effective Greenbelt policies?
Well, I think it goes back to the issue of the economy of it. In a place like Connecticut, farmers have land that is not very valuable, and they get offers to build on that land, and they're going to take it because it makes sense for their families. So how we need to address those kinds of economic disparities if we're going to have effective Greenbelt policies. I think Davis is an example of a place. I wish there was more knowledge nationwide about what Davis has done to support the economy of Yola County. Is that correct?
Right, Yolo County.
Right,
Yeah.
so that this city does not bleed into the county. But you have to have systems in place that supports this economic trade-off between building and not building. And that's what Davis has done, and as far as I can tell, very effectively.
Yeah, actually, it's a partnership between the city and the county, because you have to have both players involved to really make it work. But yeah, kind of between zoning policies and purchase of conservation easements on the farmland so that the farmland is permanently preserved as farmland. We've done a pretty good job here.
I think the other places that have policies of that type are Boulder. Of course, there is the urban growth boundary and metropolitan government in Portland. And I can't think of many more examples around the country.
Yeah, no, not a whole lot. And as you say, it's a lot about the economics of development, but also about public finance and who's getting tax revenues.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, at least in California, that's what's driving a lot of it. Well, we're at time, and I think we've done the questions. So I want to thank you so much, Norman, for taking the time to share your work with us today and really give us some inspiration. This is great. I hope to get more students interested in thinking about these street design issues. So I, at the end, like to have students unmute and do a nice verbal clapping and thank you.
Thank you for having me. It was a great
you.
Thank you.
Cheers, everybody.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Good to see everyone. Enjoy your weekends.